It was a 5-day drive to get here, 8 hours a day, and conditions are extremely harsh.
This is what everybody believes because there are no really official records, but according to online contests and weeklight, the longest distance thermal flight ever done.
The Cooper Pedy Gliding Club, both members came out to meet us. At this point, I have turned 90 degrees right to track, even though the cumulus is left of us, looking for a road to land.
Good morning, everybody. We are back on stage again. Late night soaring for the second time for this year. Even we stopped the regular sessions, but we have two really interesting things to talk about. The first we made already in January, and now we're pretty proud to have two guys from Australia here in our session. Welcome, David Jansen, and welcome, Grant Anderson.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
And of course, good morning, Benny Bachmeier.
Yes, good morning. So, why do we say good morning instead of good evening, as we always do in late night soaring? As we record this, it is 6 a.m. in Europe, so we got up really early. Usually, I only get up that early for wave soaring, but today is a different day. So, we're happy to have our guests actually streaming from Australia to us, and we are going to talk about some interesting stuff today. At least since this winter, or this European winter, people in the gliding community will already be familiar with David Jansen and Grant Anderson, who have done some amazing flights in Alice Springs this time, which has a lot of history and maybe also a lot of future and some interesting records which have been broken. Before we talk about that, some people already know David Jansen probably from at least from one different event, some different flight, which we can take a very brief look into. And maybe, David, you can also say a few words, because this is what everybody believes, because there are no really official records, but according to online contests and weeklight, the longest distance thermal flight ever done, with 1,580 kilometers and like 1,300 kilometers free distance out in one leg. David, let's get started with that and introduce you using this flight maybe, and using your history of what is gliding for you and where do you come from when it comes to gliding.
Okay, well, initially, Narromine is my hometown, a very well-known gliding site, of course, and I left Narromine in 1977 to join the military, spent 7.5 years in the military, then 36 years as a commercial aviator with Qantas, retiring during COVID in 2020, and since then I've just been doing what I really love doing, which is gliding. So back on the 5th of January 25th, or it might have been the 2nd of January 2015, there was an opportunity to fly that long distance flight. It was just basically a 1,250 declared goal flight for the 1,250k diploma, and planning was done, although I'd been thinking about it for a while. That particular route was planned the night before on a napkin, and the weather forecast indicated on the day that I took off that there would be no possibility to complete the flight, because as we continued south, there was forecast to be a huge area of overdevelopment and thunderstorm activity in Goondiwindi, and that in fact turned out to be the case. So launching at 8 a.m. through gaps in the already developing cloud layer at Kingaroy, the first thermal came to be about half a knot, at 1,400 feet above the ground, having descended through a gap in the cloud and then just sitting under that cloud layer while a slight northerly breeze blew me across what's called the Bunya Mountains, which is a range about 40 kilometres south of Kingaroy. From that point, you can see very early in that trace that little blip there after the first low point. Okay, so that's the point of the first thermal, and drifting over the Bunya Mountains, quite low above the ground, and just following the very low level but consistent cloud streeting at that point, So achieving quite a high ground speed, up to 120 kilometres an hour at that stage, and having taken off ahead of schedule. It put me well ahead of schedule at the point where these photos were taken. But you can see on the left from the photos that development, which was just from horizon to horizon, and that whole area behind it was 300 kilometres and totally washed out. So when I hit that, I decided that the flight and the goal was probably not achievable. But as you can see from the photos, the outflow from those thunderstorms was developing a really nice shelf. So I just decided I probably can't even get back to Kingaroy at this stage into the wind with these low and weak conditions. Let's just play under this shelf for a while. And I think from that first climb, I probably then went 250 kilometres without turning along the front of those thunderstorms. And as I got out to St. George, I actually saw that I was getting around the edge of the whole system. The sky was starting to open up and still ahead of schedule. Maybe there was going to be a possibility to get going. So around the corner at St. George, back on track towards my destination, and the day indeed turned out to be as good as forecast, up to 14,000 feet under cumulus, and had to travel through a couple of weather systems and eventually had to make a decision about how to get through a frontal system, which worked reasonably well. And then the cloud base went up again, but then it went blue. And you can see at that point where you were just, at that point, I'm at about 6,000 feet above the ground, I think, and looking for anything just to stay airborne and still more than 100 kilometres from my destination. But climbs were still there late in the evening, up to 11,000 feet, and I crossed the destination goal way above height, so continued further south, came back and eventually returned to Benalla, where I had an official observer waiting. I didn't expect the flight to be as successful as it was. In hindsight, if it had been considered, I would have actually continued south down past Melbourne and landed at a place called Coldstream and taken even more distance in terms of the free distance record. But it was a wonderful flight, really enjoyed the day. Taught myself a lesson on finals on that flight when I was landing in Benalla, because I'd taken lots of spare water bottles in the aeroplane and in the cockpit, and in the circuit I had rearranged those water bottles so that they wouldn't be a problem for me for the landing, which meant that I actually took my hand off the air brake handle, and on finals I was actually pulling the flap instead of the air brake. I'd reselected the wrong handle. So just a combination of being tired, change of procedures. Picked it up, fortunately, so I was able to correct the landing flap position and then use the air brakes as they should be used for the landing. So all in all, a marvellous day, and I thought that might actually be the peak of my career and my soaring performances. I thought I just cannot see how I'm going to better this flight. And in terms of thermal flying and OLC distance, I have not done that yet, although I do see a possibility in the future.
Thanks, David, for sharing that story and also for sharing your experience. It's always very, very humbling and worthwhile to hear of the mistakes of other people, and this can save lives. Actually, it's great. But we're actually not here to talk about that flight today in detail, because there's some other spectacular things having happened this year, which we are talking about. But before we get to that, maybe let's shortly introduce your companion in the cockpit, Grant Anderson.
Yeah, so I live in Alice Springs. Been gliding for about 6 years. Yeah, that's about me.
How does one get to pick up gliding in Alice Springs?
A friend of mine actually said I should join the club, and so I joined it. It's a very small club. We have probably 7 members. So yeah, 2 instructors, 3 winch drivers, and 2 of the instructors are the winch drivers.
Wow, yeah.
We have 4 gliders. We have a ASK 21, twin Astia, the Junior, and an LS7. Yeah, and I joined up, had fun. and yeah, stuck with it.
And then went ahead and bought an SZD55.
Yeah. So recently, last year, June, I bought a SZD55.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So I suppose the gliding operations in Alice Springs are kind of minimal. Let's talk briefly about the airfield. It's not Alice Springs International Airport, right?
Alice Springs Airport isn't an international airport.
Oh, sorry.
It's not Alice Springs Airport, no. About 25 kilometers north of Alice Springs is Bond Springs Airstrip. We operate out of there. It's a gravel strip, well, dirt really. We do winch launching. You can't do aerotow there. The sand and the stones kicking up will destroy the plane. There is a video on YouTube of once they did an aerotow. And yeah, it's just a cloud of dust, and that's all you see. Yeah, we operate most weekends, most Saturdays. The nice thing about Alice Springs is all year round operation. In the middle of winter, you can still get 2-3 hour long flights. We usually run a course, a 1-week course, sometime between May and August. We have some instructors coming up from interstate that do that for us. Yeah, it's a great place to fly. In summertime, when it's cooking, it's cooking. The only issue is there is very, very minimal outlanding places. And if you land anywhere but on an airstrip, you're going to do a lot of damage to yourself and the glider.
Oh yeah, that sounds really remote and really rugged. Gliding in Alice Springs does have some history, right? There were records set even before you and David set out to it. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
So the gliding club's over 50 years old. It used to actually be about 2 kilometers from where we currently are. That's now a residential street that used to be the airstrip. And then it moved out to Bond Springs. Hans Werner flew here a lot. David would probably be able to speak better about that.
I think Hans Werner was flying from 7 Mile Airstrip, which is now out on the edge of the main airport. He never flew from the Bond Springs strip at any stage. But there is a video there about him flying from Alice Springs from all those years ago. He set many world distance and speed records from his departures out of Alice Springs. There's still a record of his that is standing in terms of when continental records were introduced, when the world records were all being flown in mountain wave, and world records became basically unobtainable for people unless they actually went to those sites to fly those records, and continental records were introduced, the FAI listed the current world records as a minimum standard for the claiming of a continental record. So in terms of Hans Werner's flying, the one that's still standing there as a continental record, although not unclaimed, although it's unclaimed, is in excess of 1,300. I think it's 1,349 kilometers that he might have done.
I think it's 1379. I looked to the record list of the FII. It was 1379 in the double-seater, and he did in the single-seater. Another one was 1306.
Okay, so one of those records is standing as a minimum performance for a continental record between Australia and New Zealand, and that's something that I might look at for the next visit to Alice Springs to see if we can get above that level that he set. But that, if he did it in a double-seater, that was probably when he was flying the 25 with his wife out of Newman. So he moved from Alice Springs to Newman in the later part of his career, because Newman in far Western Australia, northern Western Australia, tends to be immune to the cyclical conditions we get here in Alice Springs. It tends to have better days more often. However, it does present thunderstorms later in the season. So that's a challenge if you go to Newman.
How far is Newman away from Alice Springs?
In excess of 1,400 kilometres, straight across the Gibson Desert without
landing. Okay. And what's the reason nobody flew in the last 50 years in this area? Why you are rediscovering it now after 50 years?
Well, I came here 20 years ago when they introduced the 15-metre records as a world record class, and flew a world record. I think it was 750k triangle at 133 in an LS6. So that was 20 years ago, my first exposure to Alice Springs off the winch. And this visit is more about being able to come here with a beautiful aeroplane, being the ASG-32MI, self-launching, and being hosted by the Alice Springs Gliding Club, who have welcomed me and made me feel very comfortable with their operation and use of their facilities. They've allowed me to use their hangar, and they've welcomed me into their club with open arms. So it's been a wonderful experience to come back here and fly. However, it was a 5-day drive to get here, 8 hours a day, and conditions are extremely harsh. The airfield is not the green that you would expect in Europe. It's the red centre, as Grant has previously mentioned. It's a gravel, dust, dirt strip, and it can be 36 degrees at 9 a.m. while you're trying to prepare the glider for takeoff. So temperatures up to 48 degrees, which is lovely.
Wow.
And thermal conditions up to 16,000 feet is what I have experienced so far, which has been a bit of a challenge for the engine and cooling. However, so far, for my whole trip, for the whole 2 months that I've been here, the 32 and the engine have performed flawlessly, thank goodness, because there's no option for me to winch launch. I don't have a belly hook, and if I'd had any technical issues whatsoever, then that would have been the end of my time here.
So Grant mentioned that aero towing at this airfield is not an option, but self-launching is.
Yes, you've got 1,800 metres of strip here. We're 2,400 feet above sea level, and even on a 36 to 40 degree day, 1,800 metres of strip is adequate to get airborne at max takeoff weight in the 32.
That's awesome. So how did you guys get in the cockpit together, and how did you plan out the, can I call it expedition, which you did to set multiple records in the past winter?
Okay, well, initially the goal was just the Australian 20-metre records. We have a subcategory for national records for the 20-metre 2-seat class. However, it does require that the aeroplane is flown 2 up. You must have somebody in the back seat with you when you're flying these records. The challenges then were finding somebody, first of all, in Alice Springs. So getting in touch with the club, the president, Joe Murphy, put me in touch with Grant. I needed somebody that was going to be able to handle the conditions in the back of the aeroplane for extremely long flights and have the time to just show up and be there. Now, Grant's in a position in an IT role that allows him to facilitate that. He can take the time that he needs, being the manager of the IT section of the company that he works for. So he's able to organise the time to be with me. He also has enough flying experience to fly the aeroplane when I need a break, when there's things that I need to do in the cockpit. And he also has the fortitude to sit there, and even on the days when I made him unwell, he still hung in there and came back for more. So my hat's off to him for being able to put up with that.
But that means you never met before. You met the first time as you arrived in Alice Springs.
At the cockpit, getting in the aeroplane.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So look, the thing with flying out of Alice Springs is it's extremely remote. It's very desolate. Obviously, you must have a safe option whenever you are planning to fly a task out of Alice Springs. So most of it comes down to the planning, and I'm talking weeks or months of preparation in terms of going through every available source for landing options so that the database can be up to date, checking every possible option via the latest satellite imagery, if that's available, so that you can discard some of the areas that are marked as serviceable airstrips, but in fact don't even exist. And getting all that in place before you ever turn up here. And then once you've got those options, you have to stay high enough to have one. And if the weather is deteriorating, or you need to, or you're getting a bit low on one of your particular legs, then you actually need to divert so that you've got a safety option to get your climb. You can't risk going through thunderstorms or rain showers hoping that there'll be something on the other side unless you've got a landing option on the other side. And The only time I thought I'll just give the glider a little wash here was when I was having a little joy flight with somebody, or actually it was at the end of the 100k speed record. I said to my passenger, well, just doesn't look like that's a microburst. We'll just go through that and give it a little wash. And it was 10 meters plus down. So I went from 3,000 feet above glide back to Bond Springs to 900 feet very quickly, and went, that's not good. So you can get into trouble here quite easily. So safety is the priority.
And
Yeah,
you have
so
now you have the advantage with all the GPS and so on to know where are the outlanding fields. I can't imagine how Hans-Werner Grosse did it 50 years ago. For me, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, wait, look, I was thinking about that too. I think we definitely have the advantage now because we have all the satellite imagery. We have very accurate weather forecasts. I think Grant was telling me that he was trying to download digital images from satellites via some sort of a hacking system, or somebody was telling me that he was getting information from somewhere. But what we have today in terms of resources, I think makes it infinitely easier. The task of choosing the flight direction, the ability to check the weather regularly, to have a look at live satellite data, it all helps to keep the flight safe and to plan what's going to happen the day before or even 4 days out.
what I sometimes ask myself is, how did Hans-Werner Grosse actually document declared turn points? Because how does the FAI and the official observer know that whatever thing in the desert he photographed is actually in the coordinate which he claimed?
Yep. Don't know. Can't answer that one for you.
Yeah, I mean, I totally believe him, and the performances he did are for sure legit. But still, it's interesting to think about how the logistics of that worked out before GPS times.
Yeah, well, Hans Werner was actually I wouldn't say a mentor, but somebody that I certainly aspired to and looked up to in my youth as a glider pilot. And in 1984, I actually had the opportunity to visit Hans Werner in Lubeck. I was on leave from a military assignment in the Sinai as part of the peacekeeping force. So basically just a young man knocked on his door and said, hi, I'm a fan. And he took me out to Lubeck and took me for a fly in a K-21. And I subsequently saw him at Lusa in 2007. I think it was probably the last time I saw him before he passed away. And yeah, really admired the man and the work that he did. He was a champion for that 1,580 kilometre flight. You know, he said you should put that up in Aero Courier, and they published the story about that flight back in 2015. So he was very much against any records that were flown in wave. He was very much a you must fly in thermals type man. So yeah, I admire him for that and for everything he achieved doing that.
So let's talk records, which you set out to break this winter. Maybe we can probably go through the chronology of the flights you did. Of course, relatively briefly, because you did a lot of flying and we don't have as much time. But maybe it's still worthwhile to just tell a couple of stories, show a couple of flight traces, and also a couple of pictures and experiences.
If I go to full screen on that, go to satellite. Okay.
Wow.
Okay, so when I first turned up in Alice Springs early in December, I had already just driven the 5 days to get here. And the very next day, we took off and did this 750 kilometre out and return flight to just a waypoint in the desert. And it was interesting having Joe Murphy on board. He was my co-pilot for this flight, the president of the club, the CFI of the club, the chief airworthiness officer for the club, winch driver for the club. So Joe was great to have on board because he was able to point out to me a few extra airfields and places along the way when we went out here. So that was something that I could add to the database. And in the right-hand corner of the screen, you can see this section of triangular type stuff in the corner of the Alice Springs steps. These are the danger areas associated with the Bond Springs gliding activity. So these were activated for us for the day, so we had no issues with the controlled airspace steps in and out of Alice Springs. This was just basically a familiarization flight for me, and we went out and back and did that at 161 km an hour. So on the way out, it was 152 kilometres an hour and 170 on the way home. So that was the introduction to Alice Springs weather and the conditions that are available here. You can see the high points right here at the end of the flight because the sky was starting to blue out in front of us. So that's topping out there. In excess of 16,000 feet, I think, was that high point for the glide home. So that was a relatively easy flight on a really nice day. No weather conditions that we had to think about. The 750k triangle, which I subsequently did with Grant, that it turned out to be a little more challenging. And this is where I was talking about thunderstorm activity. So getting through this airspace with Alice Springs, we left the danger areas. We had to get airspace clearances through here. They restricted us to stay outside of this arc. So we hit this and tried to follow the convection as best we could down to our turn points. And then the sky overdeveloped on the way home. And this is where I was talking about diverting around weather. Even though we were doing a phenomenal flight, and if we'd been able to track direct, we would have got a better result. This diversion cost us time and distance was the safer option. But even having done that, it was still 164, nearly 165 kilometres an hour with a high point of 4,900 metres. So again, another good day, but thunderstorms.
So these flights, are they like Australian speed records?
Yes, they are.
They are.
They're all Australian speed records, and they mean that if you fly a 750 kilometre triangle or out and return in excess of the 500, 300, and in Australia 200 records, then you claim those as well down the tree.
Oh, wow.
Because if you
That's
fly
a lot of records.
Yeah, in total, we've done 36, including seven.
Well, it's a season, 36 records.
Yeah, including 7 continental records.
Okay.
So, then the next big one was the out and return to Coober Pedy. So no record had been set in the 20-metre class for this particular performance. So we were waiting we needed to do a minimum of 800. No, that's for the distance to goal. Out and return. Can't remember what the previous record was. But anyway, we ended up doing 1,171 at 139 and a high point of 4,000 metres. And if we look at the trace, we used Alice Springs, the main airport at Alice Springs, as our start and finish point. The reason for that was because I wanted to not have to deal too much with these airspace steps. And if we have a look at the check airspace here, that's the 11. That's the 6,500 foot step for Alice Springs. And this first point, if I can zoom into that, is where things got tricky on this flight.
So did you have to strictly adhere to that airspace, or is it possible to get clearances? Like, how much traffic is it? I wrongly called it international airport earlier in this discussion. How much commercial air traffic is there in Alice Springs?
There's very little. We have about maybe six flights, commercial flights a day on a busy day. But there's a lot of, we have the Royal Flying Doctors, which is they go out to the remote places to provide medical services. And there's a lot of private and charter airlines going in and out of there.
Do you get clearances to cross
Absolutely.
the space?
Yes, absolutely. However, on this morning, we did not get the clearance. And this is what the issue is here that you can see coming up for me as I come out from under. This airspace that I'm currently in is controlled by the tower at Alice Springs. They have airspace up to 6,500 feet. And then as we proceed out from the airspace that's controlled by the tower, we enter into this airspace, which is also 6,500 feet as the lower level, controlled by Melbourne Centre. Now, cumulus were popping above us at this point, probably at 10 or 11,000 feet. And we called up Melbourne Centre for clearance to climb in this particular airspace, and it was denied. So at that point, we were starting to run out of opportunity because behind us, we had cumulus. In front of us, it was blue. So at this point, I have turned 90 degrees right to track, even though the cumulus is left of us, looking for a road. I was heading to this road to land because they were not giving us clearance up into the airspace, and we didn't have enough height to proceed over this terrain safely. So at that point, the road was going to be my best option. However, we got a climb and we continued on task. But because we didn't get very high here, it meant that the subsequent flight, the next half hour or so, was quite challenging for us and demanded a lot of attention until we could get out from underneath that step and get to any sort of real height, and just maintaining glide to reasonable airstrips here under the satellite imagery, which is not loading quite as fast as I'd like. I'll see if I can pull up the waypoints for you. Okay, so there was one there at Deepwell Springs that we could have got to, and then there was Maryvale Strip, but it was quite a ways out before we got a decent climb to a decent height, and then we had safety and we were able to proceed. So once we actually started getting up to 10,000 feet, then we had airspace, no airspace restrictions. Once we were outside the steps, we had landing options en route, and the flight was relatively straightforward then. And the question on this flight is there a no-go time? Is there a point when you're going to say, we're not making enough speed, we're not going to get back to Alice Springs, we're not going to complete the task, do we give it away? And this is all part of the planning as well, having steps, having time schedules that you could keep to. And realistically, the only one I had for this one was the turn point at the bottom end, provided we were there by 3:30, I think it was, local time, then we were just going to keep going. And we got there at exactly the time that was our cutoff. But getting home was not an issue then, because the airspace in Alice Springs became deactive at 6 p.m. local time. So we didn't require airspace clearances to complete the flight. And the day continued right up till sunset, which allowed us to then fly well north and extend the flight from our start-finish point well north of here back to the airport, and then eventually back to Bond Springs. So
At what time is sunset at that time of the year in this area?
7:30, 48.
Let's have a look. This is all part of the planning as well. I use Oz Runways, which is a planning tool for me. And I had to submit flight plans, because the first time I called up Alice Springs and said, or called up Melbourne and said, I want a clearance to go somewhere, they said, we don't have a flight plan for you. So I had to get to know what was going on here. So sunset is 2021, which is 10:16 UTC. Sunset's 9:52. End of civil twilight is 2021. So you've got to be on the ground before 2021. Otherwise, the flight is invalid. And we were landing at sunset. We didn't land after sunset on any of our flights. So there was no issue with that, or evening civil twilight. But this program, Oz Runways, I needed to get to learn quite well. I had to be able to submit flight plans to air traffic control, which is a little bit challenging when they're looking for endurances and fuel burns and other things like that. But anyway, they got the hang of it eventually, and we got it sorted out with them. Submitting flight plans didn't become an issue. So this is Uluru, the airspace out to the southwest of Alice Springs, and Ayers Rock and the Olgas. That's all Class D airspace, so we can go into that at any time. But all this stuff around Alice Springs is Class C or Class D in the control zone. So we either get the danger areas activated and fly unrestricted, or we get airways clearances. So Melbourne Centre, apart from this particular occasion right here, were very, very good. But here they denied us. For one aeroplane coming in from Sydney or Melbourne, they said we couldn't enter the controlled airspace. So that was a little bit of a shock, but we dealt with it and kept going.
You also flew a declared 1,250 kilometer triangle, which is something only a handful of people have ever achieved.
Good pickup. I knew I pulled it out there for you. Here again, it was a case of, we used a start on leg procedure so that if the flight was falling apart here or down here, we could just divert straight back to Bond Springs and cut out probably 200 kilometres or more of the task and get back. But as it turned out, very, very challenging at the start of the day in terms of the structure of the thermals. It just wasn't there. If you have a look at these climbs, there's a really good climb, but we're taking a lot of climbs in things that are really broken and really rough and not going very high and making it really challenging right off the bat there from that low point. We were lucky to get a good climb, but this whole initial section before we started getting up to decent altitude, and I can't see the turn, there's the turn point there. So halfway out the first leg was just rubbish and really difficult. You can see all the diversions left and right, trying to follow the cue, trying to climb 90 degrees to track here at this stage. And it wasn't until this point that the convection actually started coming up to height. But even then, if you ever had those days where the thermals are square, that's what it was like. You'd get 7 knots on one side and 0 on the other. It was slow, hard going. And this turn point out here is in the middle of nowhere. It's just a GPS position. There's no real outlanding options there. And it wasn't until we started getting back south here towards Ayers Rock that we actually had proper landing options again and further down south. But as I said, the flight was set up with a start on leg so that this particular section of the flight could be abandoned if the weather hadn't turned out. And you can see here we're challenged with the wind. The day's starting to die. The thermal conditions are getting weak and the wind is starting to have an effect on the tracking. You can see that it's pushing us away from our turn point there. There was the option to go around that turn point and climb with the wind. However, again, this is a distance flight. I wasn't really focused on the speed. And this climb was critical to us getting back to Bond Springs. So we took it, we accepted the distance penalty and the speed penalty because we just wanted to get round there. And we had a lovely convergence, not marked by cumulus or scraps of queue at the end of the day. So this turned into a really pleasant glide and we got back well above the required finish height and just on sunset. So this whole leg, you'll see some photos that you can download flying directly into the sun, taken by Grant, so I couldn't see a thing. But the GPS took us where we needed to go, and this airspace was deactivated by the time we got there. So there wasn't any problems with the airspace. But we were happy to get around that flight, and it's just a kilometre or 2 slower than the continental record. We weren't, as I said, I wasn't really focused on the speed. I just wanted to get the distance, but we can always come back and do the speed next time.
Yeah, and it's really rare to fly such a big triangle. I just checked, and on Weeklight, where there's this badge system, like it's a kind of unofficial system, but still it kind of counts. There's only 3 people who have the 1250 kilometer triangle badge, and you are one of them now. So this is great.
Where are the other two?
Yeah,
it's Oliver Schwenk and Max Schäfer, both in Namibia.
Both in Namibia done, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed the guys in Namibia went out and flew 1,200 and just 1 or 2 kilometers more on their triangle.
So it's like in the 80s, Klaus Rodekhaus was in South Africa and Hans-Werner Grosse was in Australia, and they were beating the world records.
Yes. It's happening here too.
Yeah.
And there is one more thing which I would like to talk about, which is that you also attempted something which has become a little bit out of fashion in the past years or past decades, which is the 100 kilometer speed triangle record. Because everybody's focused only on distance and 1,000 kilometers and so on. 100 kilometer speed is kind of interesting because of the like the details of the flight, of actually saving every second that counts. And you tried that too.
Yes, the day before we flew to Jamestown, we did that little 100 kilometer triangle and was successful. We had tried it previously, but missed the finish by 1 meter. So we'd done the 100K at 201 kph, but we were 1,001 meters low at the finish.
Oh, no.
So
Oh, shit. 1 meter. Oh, you're kidding.
can you believe it? It's the
No,
the
that's
height,
unbelievable, huh?
height of the cockpit. So, so we had to go back and do that again, and we weren't able to quite replicate that speed, but we got it up to 192, which is okay for a 20-meter aeroplane. I think we've got that one here. There it is, 193 or 192.7. So having spoken to the guys at CU about if you go around this thing multiple times, how do you pick the best flight? They said you just have to start adjusting parameters so you can pick one. So we did it 2 or 3 times before we got a speed that we were happy with. And on the previous ones, we just didn't finish. We just avoided the finish line and restarted the task. But these diversions cost you time. Coming back in here to follow the convergence costs you time. But this climb, which is the only climb you take, you only ever take one climb on a 100 triangle flight. This climb was, what would you call it in your terms, 6.5 meters average?
It's not too bad, I would say.
And drifting downwind. So you want to plan that climb to be on the downwind leg if you're going to be on a downwind leg. And I can't quite see the stats on that, what the rate of climb is. I might have taken it out at the bottom. But anyway, for us, it was 13 knot average. So 6.5 meters. And we got the height right this time, but just a slightly slower speed, which is okay. We can always come back and do it faster next time. But, subsequent to that, the guys in New Zealand have upped the continental record. The continental record was 206, still is, but there's now a claim in at 235 or 236 done in the wave in New Zealand.
Oh, so, okay.
Yeah, they did that only a couple of weeks after this flight. The next really big flight that we wanted to achieve was the goal flight, because there wasn't, the previous record was 1,003 kilometres set by Harry Medlicott, and there was no free distance as such. They had a minimum requirement of 803 kilometres. So what happened when I flew the flight in 2015, the continental record had been flown by some New Zealand pilots, and I'd set myself a task of 1,252 kilometres or something like that, whatever it was, on the day I flew. And the continental record was 1,254. And I didn't know anything much about continental records at that time, and I didn't expect the flight to be so successful. So planning for this flight, I thought, well, I want to exceed the continental record. So we set 1266 as our goal. And then the free distance stuff was just bonuses at the end. So the flight looked like it was going to be possible about 4 days out. I started notifying Grant that it looked like this would be coming along on this particular day because there was a huge heat wave coming out of Western Australia. The forecast for the convergence at the end of the flight was there. The trough was lying in the right position. It hadn't gone too far through. So it all looked like it might be possible. And as I wrote on my Facebook post, I'm extremely wary of loggers in 2-seat aeroplanes. So I wanted to avoid any issues with the airspace around Alice Springs, and the weather was forecast to be better out to the west. So hence we chose a start point 135 kilometres out to the west of Bond Springs. We got airborne, and about 5 minutes into the flight, I checked the logger just to make sure that the declaration was correct. And lo and behold, it had me as P1 and P2. So we turned around, went back to Bond Springs, landed, sorted that out, got airborne again with Grant in the P2 position in the logger. It all looked good, but having sorted out the declaration without doing a restart on the LX 9000 instruments, the 9070 and the 9000, there was always that little niggling doubt in the back of my mind about the declaration and whether it was going to be correct, because one little error in your declaration and the whole flight becomes invalid. Nobody's going to allow you to claim a record if the declaration is wrong.
Yeah, I know this problem. I got a lot of record flights where it wasn't, anything was wrong, missing the name of the copilot or something like that. That's really ridiculous.
Yep. I've had that scenario already on a previous Gulf flight where I broke the record previously but couldn't claim it because the P2 wasn't in there at all. And right now there's also a little issue with one of our records where our people are saying you need to notify in the initial notification. For instance, you fly the 750, you can claim the 500, the 300 and all those. They're saying you need to say you want the 750, you want the 500, you want the 300. So the very first flight here, I said, as per previous practice, I've flown the 750, we'll claim the others as well, but didn't actually write it in the initial notification. So now they may actually deny those two records.
Oh no.
Technically in the initial notification. But anyway, we're going to see if we can work through that and see what happens. So having gone back to Bond Springs, we got airborne, and you can see it's a straight line motor out to our start point. And at the beginning of any of these long flights, so we'd had a start time or a start window, 10:30, 10 to 11 o'clock. We could have left as late as 11 o'clock. And the issue with all these early morning departures or big long flights is staying airborne at the beginning of the day. And once you shut the motor down or you release from tow, the only priority is to stay airborne. Direction of travel, speed of flight, all those issues are things that are not relevant, because if you start the motor and you run out of time to do the task, then you might as well fly home. So staying airborne is the priority. So you take whatever lift you can take. And if I can change this to a zoom, let's have a look at this. So because we've got the color eyes only task option here, it doesn't show where the engine was shut down, which is somewhere back here. Then we've got to cool the engine for 6 minutes before we can eventually put it away. And I think at the start of this particular flight, when we crossed the start line, the doors might still have actually been open with the engine still up, still cooling. And we take whatever we can possibly get there. 4.3 knots is what we're getting in the first climb, which is hopeful. And we also set it up so that we were flying directly over an airfield at the beginning of the flight. So we're about 10 kilometres north of Nawituma Airport, or Nawituma Airfield, which means that if this is all going badly wrong and we're just basically trying to hang in the air with a tailwind, we're drifting towards the airport and we've got somewhere to land. Now, that's great in theory, and it worked well for the beginning of that flight for that particular section. But then we had to get to the next airport, which was quite a bit further down the road. And if I zoom out from that climb, you can see we're not having much success here as we go further down the road. So I don't know if you can see the heights, they'll be down at the bottom perhaps. So we can, yes. Okay, so we're looking for anything we can find here to try and stay airborne. And at this point, we have lost glide back to Nawitumi behind us. We don't have glide to the airport in front of us. And this wind, if that's accurate, I believe it was a little bit more to the north, was blowing against this ridge, and we were seriously considering that as our option to stay airborne if we couldn't get the motor to start. And at that point, we're at the bottom of this glide, we're down to about 1,700 feet above the ground. So we're less than 2,000 feet above the ground, which is a very, very uncomfortable place to be. And it wasn't pleasant. But the cumulus started popping and we moved around a little bit and we managed to climb there. And once we'd got that first climb, then we're up to 4,500 feet there. And we continue on until we get the first really good climbs. And just looking for, and once we're up and running, then it becomes safe. That was our next next airport there, by the way, Hermannsburg, that we wanted as our next safety. So once we had that, and we didn't have any airspace restrictions here, we're under a very high step there. It's not a problem for us. Then it was, the rest of the flight was safe. And even though we were behind schedule because things were so slow, there's really not much you can do at this point. We've decided we're going to go, and we're going to keep going. And at the end of the day, if we haven't made our goal, then we'll pick somewhere where we can land. And there were quite a few options further down the road, which we'd already spoken to the airport reporting officers. We told them we might drop in there. We found out that there were taxis available, accommodation available, people would be there to help us. So having all those cards in play before you even set off is really, really helpful. Doing all the planning, talking to all the people that you might be dealing with. And once the wind kicked in and further south, we were having ground speeds of up to 150 knots, 300 kilometres an hour. And I noticed on the WeGlide submission that there was didn't turn for 200 kilometres. I don't actually recall that particular section of the flight, but it must have been when we were coming into the convergence, and we're still getting a pretty good tailwind at very high altitude. So pretty rough country through here. If you can see all the blue dots on the screen, those are all the possible landing options. We're very lucky that this flight occurred on a weekend, so we didn't have any issues with Alice Springs. We didn't even need to talk to Melbourne Centre for clearances there. We never got into their airspace. This is the Woomera rocket range and weapons research facility. All that airspace was deactive. If any of this had been active, we probably couldn't have completed the flight, because here we're on the edge of the cumulus. To the east, it's blue. So coming down here, following the cumulus, and then there was a point here where the cumulus divided and fell apart down this section, and convection formed up north of Adelaide in a convergence up to 16,000 feet. We finished the flight much higher than we started, obviously, so the height loss of 1,000 metres wasn't a factor. And then the consideration was, will we go to Waikerie or will we go to Balaclava? In hindsight, it may have been possible to get to Waikerie, but we definitely could get to Balaclava before the sunset. And we were pretty tired at the end of this flight. So by this time of the day, while that might have been an option, the weather certainly wasn't an option. We couldn't have got there without starting the motor. We might have got more distance by going down this way in terms of the claim. But we're putting ourselves in a situation where A, we could run out daylight and invalidate the whole flight. B, we're putting ourselves in a situation where you absolutely need the motor to get to Waikerie. And if it doesn't start, then that's a problem. So we opted to go to Balaclava, where we already had an official observer waiting for us. We flew a little bit past Balaclava to extend the distance and came back and landed just before sunset.
How long you was airborne for this flight?
Total flight time, 10 hours, 23 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And an hour on the engine at the beginning of the flight. But on task, 8 hours and 157 kilometres an hour. 1,354 kilometres in terms of straight/free distance.
And in comparison with the other flight 10 years ago, the wind wasn't a big factor, wasn't it?
This, you can see the wind here on this one, all tailwind, and pretty good tailwind at that. The previous flight, we've got a wind component of 20 kilometres an hour, very helpful. And on the previous flight from 2015, I don't know, I'd have to go back and have a look at the statistics for that one.
Yeah, awesome. And then the flight back, it was a story for itself, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. The next morning, we'd decided we were looking at the ways to get home. So Lee Creek was going to be one of our first stops, and then on to maybe Coober Pedy from there, and then maybe on to Alice Springs, or maybe from Alice Springs from Lee Creek, if that was going to be possible on the day. So we got airborne at Balaclava in the morning with a forecast that indicated that we should be able to get to Lee Creek. However, that just never eventuated. The sky was totally overcast and it never really turned on. So we ended up just continuing to motor all the way out to Waikerie, which was our option from the day before. So we had people waiting for us there who looked after us, which was lovely, gave us accommodation, hangar. We were able to get some more oil for the aeroplane because that's critical on these long flights, even though we carry spare oil. Fuel was easy enough to get, but the oil's a bit challenging. So a friend of ours actually lent us some oil so we could top up the oil reservoir. And we overnighted in Waikerie. The decision to go to Waikerie in hindsight was probably not the best one because Gawler was a lot closer in terms of if we just wanted to go somewhere for the day, but we were planning on going north. So Gawler going south wasn't something that I'd really thought about. So Waikerie the next day, the forecast indicated pretty much a straight line to 16,000 feet once the temperature got to about 44 or 45 degrees. But the strip in Waikerie, if we have a look here on Oz runways again. So Waikerie an ALA, and if we have a look at the information for the strip, we've got 960 metres on the bitumen. So elevation's not really a problem, 138 feet above sea level, but the 32 needs about 850 metres as a minimum takeoff distance. So we were going to be severely compromised on takeoff performance if we waited until convection started. So we needed to get airborne while the temperature was a little bit cooler, but even so, it was still into the 40s when we got airborne. We didn't have any performance issues for our takeoff and our departure, which is good. But the issue then was that the convection never really got going. It never really got to that 40-odd degrees or 44 degrees. So we continued to motor out of Waikerie to the west to join up with the convection that had set up 2 days before. So if we have a look at the Waikerie Cooper Pedy flight, we decided we'd try for Cooper Pedy rather than for Lee Creek this time. So we'd rung ahead and spoken to those guys and said we were coming, found out we had accommodation. And this is all motoring. We thought we were going up here to Lee Creek, but the convection set up over the hills. So we motored basically into the convection, and once that got going, we were able to get up to a reasonable height and proceed on the way to Cooper Pedy. There's a little video that Grant took while we crossed the Gulf here, just south of Port Augusta. But forecast for Cooper Pedy was for thunderstorms, and indeed all through this section of the flight you can see the deviations. There were massive thunderstorms and huge microbursts, and I'm talking about the classic Killier type microburst where you could see the rain hitting the desert or the virga coming down and the outflow hitting the desert, and a classic onion ring expansion of dust, so a circular expansion of dust, and they were all around us. So we had to get through a little trough for this whole, well, a little trough, a whole area of troughs and a whole area of microbursts. Fortunately, we never got trapped by any of them. And once we got apart here and we had enough height to fly and glide into Cooper Pedy, that was done and dusted. So that was an interesting day. Total flight time, I can't even give you a distance there. Oh yes, we declared 760 so that day, but we never got a valid start because we chose Waikerie as the start point. So we were only airborne for 6 hours 44. That wasn't too bad. And then we went to a local facility in Cooper Pedy, the Cooper Pedy Gliding Club. Both members came out to meet us.
I was going to ask if there is any, because on WeGlide, I only found one ever glider flight from Cooper Pedy, and that was your flight on the following day back to Bond Springs.
Yeah, no, it's a fledgling little club, and just some enthusiastic people who want to do a little bit of flying. So,
how did you get in touch? Like, did they know you were coming? Are you connected in any way?
No, we hadn't actually contacted them, but a friend of theirs had. So they were tracking us on Flight Radar 24, which is the best source for us, because in order to get into controlled airspace, you need to be fully compliant with a Mode S transponder and be totally visible. So we come up on Flight Radar 24 because we're ADS-B compliant in and out as well. So they were tracking us and they knew when we were arriving. So they turned up when we landed just to say hello. And then we subsequently had dinner with them that night. But the motel that we'd booked accommodation with came out and picked us up, took us back out to the airplane the next morning. The manager of the hotel lent us a jerry can so we could put 10 litres of fuel in the glider again. And we were off and on our way. But when we took off in Cooper Pedy, same situation as Waikerie. The day just hadn't quite started. So we had to hang around for a little while before we could get going. And although we had declared Cooper Pedy Alice Springs, we never got a valid start on that either, because there was no way I was going to backtrack to the start point after putting the motor away for the second or third time. It was a case of just keep proceeding north until we got into convection. And if you have a look at the trace for this day, I mentioned in the write-up on, I want to look at this one. So I mentioned in the write-up on Facebook about the day, we were into a pretty strong headwind all day, and we wanted to stay right up here in the top of the height band as much as we possibly could. Getting down here was getting low because the wind was stronger down low, and the outlanding options in terms of being able to reach airfields were becoming limited. So staying right up here in the top of the height band, taking all these climbs, we weren't interested in speed or distance. We just wanted to get home. And probably about here, we called Melbourne Centre, told them that what we were planning on doing. They gave us basically carte blanche to get back to Bond Springs. If you look at our track around the end of the flight, we actually went around the Alice Springs airport so that we didn't have to worry about any traffic coming in from this direction. It was quite a strong easterly at this stage, so they were landing on 1-2 in Alice. So we went out around here following convection to stay away from the airspace, not have any problems with the Alice Springs Tower and the traffic, and to have a tailwind for our glide back to Bond Springs. But from this point, Melbourne Centre had given us clear direct Bond Springs up to 25 miles right of track as required, descend as required. So they were really helpful to get us home. And that was the last flight that we did here. The weather has now changed. We're actually going to get rain today and for the next few days. So the glider's in the box and I'm heading down south to Adelaide.
So that means you pretty much, you flew to Bond Springs to retrieve the trailer.
Yes.
Usually it works the other way around.
That's a funny story, yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
well, I actually have a camper, like a little mobile home. And when I first arrived here, I thought I'm going to live in my camper out at Bond Springs. And that turned out to be a really silly idea. So I ended up booking a hotel room for the whole 2 months so that I could have a desk, a swimming pool and air conditioning and a proper bed for the whole time that I was here. And that's really important as well. You can't come out here and think you're going to rough it because the weather will kill you. Absolutely.
I was going to ask, of course, a lot of good gliding, but the really good days were, of course, a bit far between. So what does one do in Alice Springs while on the ground?
Plan for the next one. Watch the weather every day. Stay in touch with the people that are going to support you so that they're in the loop, so that when it's on, they can be ready to go. Play with the profiles, play with instrument settings. I was having a problem with the ADS-B reception being intermittent, and I've discovered a loose connection in the TN72 GPS source. So I think that's sorted now. And having completed and reset every record there is obtainable in the 20-metre class in Australia, plus a few open class records, plus the 7 continental records, we're pretty happy with what's happened here over the 2 months.
So what's the plans for the next season? You're going back again to Alice Springs for the whole season, December till January?
There are 2 boxes I'd like to tick in my gliding career before I finish, and that's the 1500 and 2000K diploma. I am taking delivery of a JS5 in a couple of months in Europe, and we'll be flying that in Poland, representing Australia at the Polish competition. I'm not expecting anything spectacular because getting a new aeroplane and not having flown it and flying in that contest against the guys who have been in their EB29s for years and are well practiced as a team is quite challenging. So I don't have any expectations of winning that competition, but I'm looking forward to going there and flying it and getting to know my aeroplane. And then the plan is to send it via the United States to Minden to do the 1500 and 2000K diplomas. So that'll take care of next summer. I won't be here in Australia for that, should this plan come to fruition. And then that aeroplane will come to Australia, and I will have a look at what the options would be for coming back to Alice Springs with an open class aeroplane with a 60+ kilo wing loading, as opposed to the 53 kilo wing loading on the 32, and what could possibly be achieved in the open class in that aeroplane. The challenge will be that it's a 24.4 metre wingspan, which rules out most of those airfields that I can use for outlanding. So there's definitely a safety concern with that, and it may not happen. I may decide that that's not a risk I want to take with an aeroplane of that value, and indeed the 32 being a valuable aeroplane. You want to be able to put it down, firstly, in a place where it's safe, but in any case where you can survive. And in a 24 metre aeroplane, maybe that's not going to be possible on most of these airfields, because they're designed for high wing Cessnas. They're pretty narrow, and it would be survivable, but you'd probably wreck your aeroplane.
I have one last question, which I'm not sure if any of you can answer. Have you ever flown in other desert areas of the world, like South Africa, Namibia, or the Western continental United States? And can you compare of what it's like there compared to the red center of Australia?
I've not flown in Namibia. It was part of my plan for this season if the aeroplane had been ready, but it wasn't quite, so I couldn't go. And I have flown in, of all places, Israel.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
And that was just a very short flight in the desert, so nothing of any particular note. It was just a visit to the local gliding club and a hello and a joy flight. I've flown out of Minden before, and it's a very different world again. Again, high desert and mainly high mountain flying is what you're looking at in that area. And in South Africa, I've flown out of Potchefstroom. So I flew the JS3, which Ace was kind enough to lend me when I didn't have anything to fly, waiting for the JS5, and did a 500 at 179 or something kph. So it was it's a nice place to fly, and the thing with these sort of conditions with places like South Africa, Namibia, and Australia, if you're going to fly out here, is you've got to have height. You can't go cross country on a bad day. You've got to try and stay high all the time and have options. Do you have any more questions for Grant at all about how he experienced it all?
So yeah, maybe Grant, are you going to how are you going to utilize the experiences you gained with David, and how did the rest of the club in Born Springs pick up the experiences made with David?
Well, as I said, David, I learned a lot. Flying with someone of his caliber is always basically an honor and a privilege. I didn't really ask him many questions, but I watched very closely what he did. And yeah, I learned a lot. David was very generous with his time for the other club members. He took other club members in the plane on various days. And then probably last week, the week before,
A couple of weeks ago.
a couple of weeks ago, he was going to take everybody for about an hour's flight, but the weather just fell apart and we couldn't go. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure having him. Keep on telling him I'm going to miss him being around. It's going to get boring. But yeah, it's been great having him, and wish him all the best and hope he comes back again.
Great. David, Grant, it was a pleasure to talk to you, and really interesting to get some insights into flying in the red center of Australia, and as we said, rediscovering Alice Springs, because it's been a long time since the broader gliding community has last heard of that place in terms of flying long distances and records. So thanks very much for all your insights, and you have a great evening. We will have a good morning now. And yeah,
You have to go to work now, Benny.
I do.
Thank you so much for the invitation. A pleasure meeting you both. Thank you for your time.
No, thank
Right.
you for your time. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you.
Okay, guys, have a good day. All the best.